So we're going to use this thing called Mentimeter. So if you're not watching this on your phone and you have a smartphone and you have access to the internet, head over to menti.com, and then there's a code at the top, which is 203093 and you can use that, and or hopefully, just because I appreciate there's a lot of wisdom in the room, and I want to try and make use of that and make space for that, because there's a lot of experts in schools work in the room, and I want to try and make sure that this isn't just one person's perspective, but we get to hear and have a bit more of a sense of what's going on across not just our area or even the country, but across maybe even some different countries as well. So while you guys are doing that, I think a few people have jumped in, which is great already. I want to share a real life story. I don't know about you, but I've recently got into some, like, those movies about real life stories. I think there's something incredible about the idea that some true lived experience is always really fascinating. And also there's always that like added tension of like something could go wrong at like any second, as real life often does. I find that tension really like captivating. So one story I want to share is of this guy called Mark Inglis. So in 1982, Mark Inglis was a professional search and rescue mountaineer for the Aoraki, I think that's how you say it, Mount Cook camp in New Zealand. And just for a bit of context, Mount Cook is over 3.7 kilometers high. So that's basically the same as like traveling up just under 2.5 miles. It takes about 10 to 20 hours to reach the summit. And it's super dangerous. You have to battle like hypothermia, lightning, rock falls, avalanches, heart attacks, and people also died from plane crashes. And I think just under 250 people have had their lives claimed by this mountain in trying to search for the top. And also, in case that wasn't enough, in case that wasn't like difficult enough for you, you also only have 2/3 of the oxygen you would normally have at sea level. And so you're constantly out of breath, constantly knackered, constantly tired. And it was on one fateful day in 1982 that Mark and his climbing partner, Philip, became trapped near the summit. And a sudden storm developed, and around 6 p.m. they realized they were in trouble. They tried to like move, but they couldn't face the wind for more than a few meters. And so the next thing I want to try and get you guys to do is, I would love to know, those of you who are logged in, what would you do next? So you have an option to vote. And maybe if people can't do that, maybe Shah, you could chuck in a few comments on their phones. Okay, so it seems like the overwhelming thing is to find shelter. Interesting. And so that's actually one of the things they tried to do. They ended up trying to have to find an ice cave called the Middle Peak Hotel, and they ended up barricading themselves basically in there as this storm became worse and worse. And as the idea of self-rescue kind of became a pipe dream, they realized that their legs were frostbitten. And it turns out they had to stay there for 13 days until they were able to be rescued. 13 days, which is absolutely insane. When Mark was asked whether he ever wanted to give up, he said this: "In some ways, always, in other ways, never. It would have been so nice to be transported off the mountain, but then reality hits. It won't happen." And then when he was asked what kept him going, he said, "Knowledge and faith, that we had seen, experienced, and trained for this. We could make decisions that would allow us to survive, despite knowing that we might lose a few toes. Faith in that we knew we could be rescued. It was a matter of when, not if. Hence our job, our focus was simply to survive." Our job, our focus was simply to survive. Mark's story gets even more incredible once he ends up getting down the rest of the mountain. I encourage you, if you get a chance, to look it up. He's done some incredible things since then. And the reason I picked this story and not one of like an athlete doing an endurance race, I'm not sure if you heard from Phil Togwell, but he ended up running 55 on the host from this morning, ended up running 55 kilometers on Saturday, which is over a marathon, which is absolutely bonkers. And people have traveled incredible distances and run hundreds of miles and things like that. But the reason I wanted to share this story as opposed to that was because I felt like, I don't know about you, but endurance races, people train for, people end up preparing for. Like, that wasn't the first time Phil had run. He ended up doing a long training program until he felt he was able to go and do this 55-kilometer run. Whereas in March, I don't think any of us were really ready for this. I remember one moment I was doing school retreats about relationships to year 10s, and then my housemate had a temperature and we had to quarantine for 2 weeks. And when I came out, like pasta was like the new currency, and like toilet roll was worth its weight in gold. Like it seemed like it was such a different world. And I don't know about you, but I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready. It wasn't something I put myself in by choice. And it felt almost like a moment of trauma rather than a moment of endurance. Like there's a sense of survival. And someone explained it to me like this: in some ways in trauma, we have different stages. And while it's not linear, an expert once mentioned to us that there's a few phases people go through, one of which being like a heroic phase where people try and like just soldier on and carry on through. Another one being like disillusionment, with this idea where the world around you is kind of like crumbling and disappearing. And then this final stage of rebuilding. Like, I don't know if any of those resonate with you. Maybe you're on that journey, maybe you flitted between some of them. But I think for all of us, we can realize that maybe this has changed our schools work quite a lot. And so I would love to know, how much over the last 6 months have you felt like you've been in survival mode? Yeah, interestingly, like I think regardless of where you end up putting there, I think we can see that we're not alone in this, regardless of how you felt, maybe whether you felt like normal or whether you felt like you've been in survival mode quite a lot of the time. You can appreciate that this cultural moment is something that's affecting all of us, not just our local area. A friend of mine wrote this, a friend of mine wrote this article, and he said this: Christian schools workers in crisis. Many schools workers are having to work out what their role is in a rapidly changing educational environment. This isn't just an issue for the schools and youth workers involved, it's something for the church as a whole to consider. It's time for a radical rethink of what it means for the church to engage with the educational system in our country, which might end up with this embarking on a risky, unknown road, but one that I passionately believe we must take. If we don't, we risk losing the ground gained in the past decades, finding our strategies outdated and ineffective, and being overtaken by government reform. In short, the death of schools work. Oof. Stark words and harsh words there for sure. And maybe this is something you resonate with. Maybe you can see this person's point of view, or maybe you disagree with them. But the interesting thing about this was this article was written 15 years ago. This wasn't something that the person was prophesying this worldwide pandemic, nor were they exaggerating what was going on in 2005, as some of the systems of the late 90s and early noughties weren't working in our schools anymore. And as the current cultural landscape shifted once again, they're struggling to adapt and keep up. But I think there's something to ask ourselves around this idea of, like, I don't think this is the first crisis we as a schools work community have faced. And I personally don't think this will be the last. So when we come to the question of can we endure, in short, I think yes. I don't think this is the moment where God is asking us to down our tools. I don't think this is the moment where those schools we work in or the relationships that we hold so precious and the work we do with young people is over. I don't think God is finished with us or our students or our schools at this present time. And so I also appreciate that this idea of can we endure is highly contextual, both in terms of like demographically and geographically, but also in terms of finances at the moment, with trusts playing such a big part in the work that a lot of us do, and that being so scarce at the moment. That will change for all of us. So in this, I'm going to try and share a little bit about what Youthscape have been doing, and a little bit about how we've kind of been thinking and some of the stuff we've been experimenting with. We try and adapt to this current cultural landscape. So one of the first things I think that any hero does in a survival story is assess the situation. There comes a moment where they take stock for a second and they realize that they need to understand the situation they're in, what they've got, the resources they have, and kind of proceed as their plan may have already changed. And so I think obviously September's behind us and schools are kind of navigating their new risk assessments and figuring out how they use PPE correctly and how they make sure like young people are socially distancing, all that kind of stuff. And that's definitely one aspect of trying to assess where the school is at, but also to try and assess where we're at as well, as organisations, as schools workers, both in terms of the resources we have, but also maybe the stuff we might need to drop as well. I don't mean people on our teams, more like the programmes and the seminars and stuff like that. In some cases, we're back to square one. In schools that we've worked in for so many years, we're already having to treat them as if they're brand new. And so just the I would love to know a little bit about what the landscape for you looks like. Can you currently go into schools? Yeah, so the vast majority of people are saying they can't go into any schools, but there's also some new opportunities. I think that's one of the things that we've found really like painful and traumatic here at Youthscape, is not being able to do the stuff that we normally do, that we've been doing for years and for decades. Jerome shared a little bit about it earlier in this live stream. Absolutely. I think one of the things that also really helped me try and establish what it looks like going into schools in the future has been trying to establish who the gatekeepers are. And I use this image in terms of the people you have to pass in order to be able to access the school and the school's work that you want to try and do. And this, one of the reasons I think this is really helpful to do is over the last 7 months, teachers' job roles would have changed. People, new members of staff might have joined, people might have left, but also the people, your normal contacts, may no longer have the responsibility or the power to make those decisions in order to let you into the school. All those situations have happened for either me or Charlotte. When we chatting to her, and she's saying that about having to start back at head teachers again, and the difficulty in almost seeming like we're going back to square one. And it may be like PAs of people or different pastoral heads or deputy heads or whatever it is, but I think it's worth touching base with those people and trying to establish what that looks like. One of the next things I think has been really helpful for us to look at Youthscape is in vision, vehicles and values. And so I would love to know what your vision for schools work was before lockdown. This might be like a vision statement you guys have, or it might be just maybe a couple of sentences, or yeah, a sentence. Nice. Getting some answers like that at the moment. Great, there's lots of amazing different visions there for schools work. I think it's worth noting that it's obviously really highly contextual, and also our understanding and outworking of schools work is very different as well, as the gospel is complex and God is also calling us to do different things. And so I'd love to also know, what was your vision for schools work now? Yeah, great. Yeah, I think one thing you guys are really highlighting there is that often a lot of the stuff with our vision doesn't change. One of the things that I think is so important is the idea of clarity at this moment, because it's one of the easiest things to come back to our vision in moments of crisis. As schools workers, we bring something different to the table, and we expand on a holistic understanding of who God is. We bring hope, we bring life to live to the full, we bring joy. And I think that can be also really difficult at some level, especially in moments like now when the need is so great, when you could do so much. And that's what I feel like this blue circle represents, the idea that we could be doing, I don't know, lessons, assemblies, counselling, mentoring. We could be trying to serve the school after, in post-lunchtime clubs, whatever it looks like. But we also know that we're only called to some things. That our role as school workers is not to do everything, but to do the thing that God is calling us to do something. And that's what this pink circle is. And often it's so difficult, not just because when teachers trust us and love us, they ask us to do lots of different things because the need is high. And also there's a culture that I think, if you're like me, it kind of seeps into our schools work of trying to do more and be more. And this idea of busyness is success, which often tries to make us do more outside our vision than maybe we want to. But God doesn't call us to that. I think it's also worth looking at vehicles. And by this, I mean the means by which you engage with young people. So that could be lessons, it could be neat work, it could be Christian unions, whatever it was maybe before lockdown. They're the vehicles that we maybe use, detached work, in relating to young people. And I think that, yeah, I guess I think it's important to recognize maybe what those are and separate them from our vision. And so I'd love to know what are the vehicles that you use or maybe did use before lockdown. What are the things that the ways you interacted with young people? Could be assemblies or RE lessons, sports groups. Drop it in, nice. Nice. There's loads of different ways and vehicles that people have been using. Assemblies and mentoring, some of the bonds that bigger people are saying more of. Lunchtime clubs. Spaces. One of the things that, the reason I'm showing this image, I think in most like post-apocalyptic films, you often get this image of like vehicles strewn by the side of the road, both in like, this is from I Am Legend, but there's other films as well. They kind of show that vehicles are often one of the first things that seem to go in this idea of this post-apocalyptic world. I'm not trying to suggest, I know it's a massive exaggeration to say we're living in post-apocalyptic world right now, but I think the metaphor still could be valuable. I think this idea of when in crisis, vehicles are the first things to go because they're difficult to run, because you might not even want to go anywhere, because the fuel that, like the things that fuel them no longer seem viable, and also because the things that are inside them are more important, like the people are more important than the vehicles. And so that's why they get left by the side. As Mark Inglis said earlier, we could make a few decisions that would allow us to survive despite knowing that we might lose a few toes. In this current landscape, no vehicles are safe, regardless of how much we love them or how much we used them before. None of them are above us having to reassess and maybe reevaluate what that looks like. And of course, it's painful. And of course, the process of letting go of some of that stuff we've been doing for years and decades is really tough. We at Youthscape had a really tough process of trying to shed of stopping our daily drop-in, which is some of the stuff that where all our relationships in school often came out and were, I guess, embedded into the rest of the work we do. And so we found it like quite painful to say we have to stop it until Easter, but that didn't mean that that was the end of the way we worked with young people till Easter. It just meant that we had to find something different that was safer and more appropriate. Sometimes we have to change even if our values do not. Values are often the thing that defines our school's work, the thing that we, I guess the feelings that we want young people and teachers to experience when we interact with them. The way a friend of mine explained it is that, you know, when you go to a seaside town, there's like you buy a stick of rock and it's got like a name running all the way through it. Values are like the thing that runs all the way through the school's work that we do. And it could be things like inclusivity or fun or joy or empowerment or like learning, whatever it is. But I'd love to know, what do you think the values are, the main values in your school's work? And again, I appreciate all of these could be contextual. It fills me with so much hope when you see all this kind of written down in front of you. This is kind of the school's work that we value and the stuff we think is really important. And these are the things that often shape the vehicles that we end up choosing. I think being flexible, it's important to be flexible and adaptable and proactive. And I appreciate there's also a need to kind of stick and make sure you're staying where God calls you to. But we need to make sure that we're doing just that rather than going along with trends or like following on with like the vehicles metaphor. Like, you want to make sure we're not hitchhiking. Like, we want to make sure our standards are high rather than just anything that's going in the same direction we are. We want to make sure we choose the vehicles specifically and for the right reasons. And we hold on to those vehicles loosely, but hold on to God tightly. Also, incarnation is another one that could be worth thinking about at this moment, in terms of, as Christians, we believe in a God who is with us and chose to be with us through the incarnation. And we try and echo that in our schools work. That's one of the reasons why schools work is so great, is because we get to be in the spaces where young people are, where they spend most of their time away from home. And we value this idea, and we're trying to echo that idea that God is with us. And so we go to where the young people are and the children are. However, what does that look like when proximity and physical proximity is so dangerous? I think that's a really important question for us to kind of wrestle with as we move forward. And so I just want to show you and maybe share a couple of models that we at Youthscape have been trying to wrestle with and grapple with over the last few months. One is third space. You may have heard this term before. We've been banding around a little while. We didn't invent the term by any means. Starbucks define themselves as a third space away from home and work. In the context of Christian schools work, as Christian visitors into schools, we tend to operate in two main spaces. The first space being like the curricula, so the assemblies, the lessons, the kind of stuff that fits within the timetable. But I don't know about you, but often when I do assemblies, ends up that they get told off on the way in because they're not coming in quietly enough. And then there's a hockey notice, and then the bell goes. You had like 3 minutes to do your entire assembly that was like deeply profound and you prepared ages for. Like we get to encounter lots of young people, but we don't often get the depth we would love to do. And so that's the first space. The second space is this idea of the extracurricular. So like the lunchtime clubs, Christian unions, breakfast clubs, detached work, this kind of stuff is outside of the main space. But often these things don't always get the same amount of interactions we would like. So the depth of relationship is high, but the numbers are a bit low. And so we at Youthscape were kind of wondering, is there a third space that we could use in our schools work? And we kind of realized that maybe there's the option of using shared spaces. So like the canteens, the corridors, the hallways, the playgrounds, or like fields, depending on what your school's like. And maybe this is something you already do. But when I first heard about this, it was news to me. This is idea of kind of going to where the young people often have their own conversations that matter most to them, where they can get to go deepest without red tape, without this idea of teachers maybe interacting or guiding them. They can kind of question some of these bigger things that really are important. And so that's one of the things we've been trying to do a little bit at Youthscape. One of the things that came out of our research team was that young people weren't asking questions in the same way that we had, rather they had been doing in previous times gone by. And so one of the things we tried to design all our stuff to do is to provoke curiosity and to disrupt and interrupt the rhythms that they normally have, and to also be unapologetically deep, like to know what we stand for and to not be afraid of saying that as well. If you want to just for a second ascribe to those three spaces, just temporarily, I would love to know what kind of spaces are you or were you working in? I think it's also worth saying that this third space stuff works best when it's with first or second space. Like we're not trying to remove that by any means. I think it works best when we interact with those things as well, but giving young people options to encounter God in other spaces when they're expecting it as well. Great, a nice real mix, which is really encouraging. Just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into too much more detail, but I'll drop my email in the chat. If third space in any way, this is an example of we made a third space locker kind of using a school locker, and each one had a different idea of what the afterlife looked like based on different religions or different ethical viewpoints that fit in with their curriculum in year 7. And so this was one small section of what paradise could look like. Yeah, I won't go into too much more depth just because of time, but if that does interest you, feel free to drop me an email, or you can find out more about third space stuff on our website. This also, one of the reasons this works well is because some of these things don't need human interaction in terms of need school workers. You can often leave these things in places and almost step back and let them people interact with them themselves. And so in the current climate, you could almost set it up on a Friday, which you've done before, and then it'd be ready to go on the Monday all the way through, which could be really helpful. Another model which I'll go through briefly is remote schools work. Jima shared a little bit about this at the beginning, but I don't mean doing this digitally, like through Zoom, but something slightly different, maybe where we're trying to empower the teachers and the schools staff themselves to be the ones that end up delivering schools work. We realized that in occasions before lockdown, we wanted a school to do a project such as like an arty project where we've got them to ask what kind of questions you ask if God appeared in front of you. And we ended up getting to decorate a postcard with that, and we then ended up making into an art installation that was put up in their school. However, rather than leading the art sessions or being in for the 15 minutes of tutor time every day for a week, we made a video, and then we sent the equipment and stuff into the school, and then they were able to deliver that through their own lessons in their own time when it suited them. And I think that's one of the things that also helps them in terms of empowers them to make those decisions and fit it into their schedule rather than us interrupting, which some teachers, I don't know, some teachers don't always appreciate some of the work we do. And I think it's important that maybe to establish that while this isn't ideal, I think it could be really helpful to know how to empower the teachers to be able to do some of this stuff when we physically can't go into some of the schools themselves. I know a lot of them in our local area, ones we can't get into, still would love us to go in. And so if there's any way we could still interact with these young people or help them and support them in any way, they're still crying out for that. They just don't know how to let external visitors in safely. And so I think that's something that not to give up and just keep asking questions of how can we do this? What can we send in? What can't we send in? Is a really important one to try and do, whether it's a video or whether it's craft materials or whether it is worksheets, whatever that is you guys normally do. Is there a way you can adapt that to be a bit more remote? One of the examples that Joanna used before in the chat, in the live streaming this morning, was Thrive, which one of the ways it works best is because it's 15 different things that the teachers get to piece together into whatever lesson plan they want that to look like. And so there's flexibility for them depending on the age or depending on how they know their students best. But yeah, again, if you want any more about that, feel free to come drop me an email or chat to me if you get a chance. I've run through all of those super quickly. If you have any real questions, yeah, please don't hesitate to get in touch. But other than that, I think I'm going to hand over to Charles to maybe do some breakout rooms where you kind of ask some of those questions, maybe agitate some of those thinking.
Thank you so much, David. That was really, really helpful. I love what you said about the vehicles thing. You know, when there's the apocalypse and they're the things that are strewn to the side. I've never thought about it like that. But yeah, I guess we've had to let go maybe some of our structures and forms to allow for new structures and forms in this new, it's the same landscape, it's the same school, but it's completely different landscape. So of course we're going to have different vehicles to manage that terrain. I thought that was really amazing. Yeah, just way to capture that. So as David says, he's got some questions for us in our breakout room. So I'm just going to post them in the chat here. So they're there. If you could copy them and make a note of them. I'm going to put you into breakout groups. Just like as David was saying right at the start, it's just so great to hear from each other. We're all practitioners. We're all doing something. We've all got something to learn from each other. So I'm going to put you into breakout rooms. David, thank you so much for what you shared. We'll leave it there. I hope you've been blessed and continue to be blessed through the New Hope Day.